My divorce lawyer slid a printed spreadsheet across the table and asked me one simple question. Do you recognize any of these 27 names? I scanned the list, and my stomach dropped because I recognized every single one. They were employees at my father's company, people I'd worked alongside for years, people I'd trusted with quarterly reports and client contracts, and in some cases, my own personal cell phone number. Next to each name was a hire date, a job title, and a single word in bold red letters: asset. My mother-in-law hadn't just disapproved of me marrying her son. For 6 years, she had been quietly building an army inside my father's company, one hire at a time, and I hadn't seen any of it until the exact week my marriage finally fell apart. My name is Sarah. I'm 33 and I run operations at a mid-sized logistics company my father, Walter, built from a single delivery truck almost 30 years ago. I've worked there since I graduated college, first in customer service, then in scheduling, and eventually into operations, learning the business from the ground up the way my father always insisted I do. I married my husband, Ryan, 7 years ago, and from the very first family dinner, his mother, Diane, made it clear she thought I wasn't good enough for her son. She ran her own consulting firm, sharp, ambitious, and used to getting exactly what she wanted, and she never fully hid her disappointment that Ryan had chosen someone from a trucking family instead of someone from the kind of circles she preferred. For years, I told myself Diane's coldness was just old-fashioned snobbery, the kind of thing you learn to smile through at holidays and otherwise ignore. She was polite enough in public, generous with gifts, always technically appropriate. It was only small things that felt off. The way she asked detailed questions about my father's business at every dinner, the way she seemed to know more about our client contracts than a mother-in-law reasonably should, the way she occasionally recommended wonderful candidates for open positions at the company, people I later learned had somehow always heard about the job before we'd even posted it publicly. My father used to joke back then that Diane had a nose for talent, and I used to laugh along with him, never once wondering why her nose only ever seemed to point in one direction. Looking back now, I can see how normal it all seemed at the time. Diane had connections everywhere through her consulting work, through boards she sat on, through decades of networking across the industry. When she recommended someone for a warehouse supervisor role, or a logistics coordinator position, or even a seat in our finance department, it never seemed strange on its own. My father trusted referrals from people he respected, and Diane, whatever her personal coldness toward me, had built a reputation as someone with sharp professional instincts. Over 6 years, one recommendation at a time, 27 of Diane's people ended up working inside my father's company, spread across nearly every department that mattered. The marriage itself started falling apart about a year before the divorce, slowly at first, the way most marriages do. Ryan became distant, working later, traveling more for a job that seemed to require less travel than he claimed. I found messages I wasn't supposed to see, nothing dramatic at first, just enough to know something had shifted between us long before either of us said it out loud. When I finally asked him directly, he admitted to an affair with a coworker, and within a few weeks we'd agreed to divorce as amicably as two exhausted, hurt people can manage something like that. It was during the divorce proceedings, while my lawyer was reviewing shared financial accounts and joint assets, that things took a turn I never expected. Ryan and I had shared a cloud storage account for years, mostly for photos and shared documents like our mortgage paperwork. My lawyer, a careful, thorough woman named Michelle, was going through everything methodically to make sure nothing financial was hidden before the settlement, standard procedure in any divorce involving shared accounts. Buried in a folder Ryan had apparently forgotten still synced automatically to our shared drive, labeled simply Mom Q3 Reports, Michelle found a spreadsheet that had nothing to do with our marriage at all. The spreadsheet tracked 27 names, each one an employee at my father's company, alongside hire dates stretching back nearly 6 years, job titles, departments, and a column labeled Reporting Frequency. Next to almost every name was a note about information they'd apparently been sharing, client renewal dates, pricing structures, upcoming contract negotiations, internal staffing changes, even details about an expansion my father hadn't yet announced publicly. At the top of the spreadsheet was a header that made my hands go cold. Hartwell Logistics, Asset Tracking, Q3 Review, followed by Diane's own initials. Michelle asked me gently if I recognized the company name at the top. I did. Hartwell Logistics was a competitor, smaller than my father's company until recently, but growing fast, aggressively undercutting bids on contracts my father's company had held for years. Contracts that always seemed to slip away right before renewal, at prices that made no sense unless someone already knew exactly what we were planning to offer. I had assumed for over a year that Hartwell simply had a lucky streak or an aggressive new sales team. I never once considered that someone inside our own walls, 27 someones, might have been feeding them everything they needed to win. I called my father that same night, my hands shaking as I explained what Michelle had found. He was quiet for a long time on the phone, the kind of silence that told me he was doing the same painful math I already had, remembering every contract we'd lost, every strange coincidence he'd chalked up to bad luck or tough competition. He asked me to send him the spreadsheet immediately, and within an hour, he'd called our company's attorney, a man named David Foster who had handled our legal matters for over a decade. The following weeks were a blur of quiet, careful investigation. My father brought in a forensic accountant and a corporate security consultant, both of whom worked discreetly to avoid tipping off anyone before we understood the full scope of what we were dealing with. We went through 6 years of hiring records together, my father and I sitting at his kitchen table late into the night, matching names on the spreadsheet to hire dates, referral sources, and department assignments, watching a pattern emerge that neither of us had ever noticed while it was happening in real time. What they found was worse than the spreadsheet alone suggested. Diane hadn't just been placing people inside the company to gather information. She had been positioning them strategically over years into roles with access to different pieces of the business. One person in finance who could see pricing structures, another in operations who knew contract renewal timelines, another in customer service who heard directly from clients about upcoming needs before those needs ever reached our sales team. No single person had enough access to raise obvious suspicion. Together, spread across the company, they had access to almost everything. It became clear piece by piece that Diane's consulting firm had a quiet, informal arrangement with Hartwell Logistics, helping them restructure their sales strategy in exchange for a retainer that on paper looked like any other consulting contract. In reality, that retainer appeared to be compensation for information her network inside my father's company had been feeding her for years, information she then repackaged and delivered to Hartwell as market insight and strategic recommendations. The hardest part wasn't understanding what Diane had done. It was understanding why. My father's company had never been in direct competition with Diane's consulting firm, and on the surface, there was no obvious reason for her to target us specifically, beyond the fact that her son had married into our family. David Foster, working with the forensic accountant, eventually found the answer buried in Hartwell's own corporate records. Diane held a significant, quietly structured equity stake in Hartwell Logistics itself, an investment she'd made almost 7 years earlier, right around the time Ryan and I had started dating. The more Hartwell grew at my father's expense, the more her own investment was worth. My marriage to Ryan hadn't just given her a front-row seat into our family's business. It had given her a personal, financial motive to make sure that business struggled while her own investment thrived. Once we had enough documentation, laid out clearly and unmistakably, my father made the decision to go to the authorities rather than handle it quietly through private settlements. Corporate espionage, especially involving falsified consulting contracts and coordinated internal information sharing, wasn't something he was willing to simply absorb and move past. Several of the 27 employees cooperated once confronted with the evidence, explaining that they genuinely believed they were simply providing industry insight to a respected consulting contact of a coworker's family, without fully understanding or choosing not to understand how directly it was undermining the company that employed them. A handful of others, closer to Diane personally, had known exactly what they were doing, and those were the ones who ultimately faced the most serious consequences, including termination and, for a few, separate legal action tied directly to the information they'd knowingly shared. Diane, when confronted formally through her own attorney, denied any wrongdoing at first, calling the whole thing a misunderstanding about consulting boundaries. That story became much harder to maintain once David Foster presented the equity documentation alongside the spreadsheet Michelle had found, showing a financial motive too specific and too well-timed to explain away as coincidence. Ultimately, facing the threat of a formal corporate espionage lawsuit backed by clear documentation, Diane agreed to a settlement that included divesting her stake in Hartwell Logistics, paying substantial damages to my father's company, and signing an agreement that legally barred her from any future involvement, direct or indirect, with our business. Ryan, for his part, insisted he had no idea about any of it, and honestly, having gone through the divorce process with him, I believe that specific claim. He was hurt and humiliated learning what his own mother had done, quietly, for years, using his marriage as a doorway into a family that had never done anything except welcome him. It didn't repair our marriage, which had already ended for entirely separate reasons, but it did give him, I think, a clearer, harder look at exactly who his mother really was underneath the polished exterior she'd always presented to the world. It's been almost a year now since the divorce was finalized, and the whole situation with Diane was settled. My father's company has recovered faster than we expected, helped significantly by the contracts we won back once clients understood what had actually happened to their pricing and renewal terms over the past few years. I still work there, now more involved than ever in how we structure hiring and information access across departments, changes my father jokingly calls the Sarah protocols. Designed specifically so no single external relationship could ever again quietly plant that many people inside our walls without someone noticing far sooner than we did. What I learned from those 27 names is something I don't think I'll ever fully shake. Betrayal doesn't always look like a single dramatic moment. Sometimes it looks like 6 years of small, reasonable-seeming favors, one recommendation at a time, until one day you look up and realize the person who never liked you had quietly built an entire structure inside your family's life's work, waiting patiently for the exact right moment to profit from it. I want to know what you think. Have you ever discovered a betrayal that had been building for years right under your nose? Let me know in the comments below, and if this story kept you hooked until the end, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe to True Life Drama for more stories just like this one every week. Thanks so much for watching until the very end, and I'll see you in the next story.